Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. Paddy, how are you this week?
Positively fantastic. How are you?
I'm excellent.
Did you watch the game yesterday?
Fantastic. I didn't, but I listened to it on Kerry Radio, which was hilarious because I was trying to listen to it like with the perspective of someone who wasn't Irish or just wasn't from Kerry, and it was just the accents were just fantastic.
Yeah. The Chad Dublin beating the Virgin Kerry yet again.
Scumbags.
Look, I just love how the whole country basically turns into the same thing, like the Premier League does. It's like anyone but United, or anyone but Liverpool. Like they just hate those clubs. Like the whole country is like, oh, we all support Kerry now just because they all hate the Chad Dublin. But look, the Chad Dublin doesn't even fucking care because we still go on to nomination with the whole country against us. It's fun. But look,
out the fucking kingdom.
The only good thing about Terry was fungi. But anyway.
There's loads of fungies.
Yeah, that's because he died, like.
Don't tell the kids that, man.
Anyway, what are we going to talk about today?
Talking about the limits of quote-unquote flexible dieting. And I put that in quotes because what flexible dieting means in theory, or in practice rather, is different to what people who actually try to define flexible dieting and flexible eating behaviors, what they actually mean. So, if you were talking about flexible eating behaviors in the research, that means something different to the actual flexible dieting that people typically think of. So when I say
it's better to even just define it as like the IIFYM cult, that culture, community, whatever the fuck.
Yeah, basically what we could summarize it as like the limits of a calorie-centric approach to nutrition, as in your focus just on calories, like maybe on macronutrients as well, but you totally disregard food quality. And this is something that is, prevalent in some corners of the fitness industry, not so much in others. And that can be potentially just a side effect of the pendulum swinging, because obviously if you'd went back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it was very much, the bodybuilding and fitness sphere was all about particular foods. It was all about the foods that you were eating. There was a limited list of foods, specific times that you had to eat, specific nutrients. And then obviously the pendulum, came back towards the center and people were like, oh, calories actually matter. And it's about macronutrients, that matters too. And then some people kind of take that a bit too far to say that, it's just all about your calories, bro. Doesn't matter what you eat and you don't need to worry about nutrient timing ever. And that is it's probably not the best approach to nutrition for health or for body composition and performance. Yeah. But also for health. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because, like, personally, I've been trying to lose a bit of weight recently. Okay. So I say weight because I'm trying to make an actual weight class. So it's not just fat. It's like actually just trying to lose weight. And as part of that, I've been
skinny, is what you're saying.
Pretty much. And as part of that, I've been adjusting my food choices. So changing some of the food choices that I've been making, versus what I would normally make. So generally, I would have quite a bit of flexibility in my diet. I wouldn't have like that much structure day to day, and I kind of like let it roam a bit freer, you could say. Whereas now things are a little bit tighter. I'm more careful about the food choices I make, and I'm thinking about how will this contribute to my satiety? How will it, will this fill me up enough? Or, because my food choices are more limited in that I don't have enough calories to work with, I'm asking myself, how can I maximize the nutrient density of my diet so that I'm still meeting my micronutrient requirements while having restricted calories? So that's what kind of prompted this discussion. And I do think it's an important one to have.
Yeah, because there's actually quite a few aspects to this. which, like you said, it is that pendulum swinging where before, you know, you had just like, oh, it's all about the meals you eat. You have to have tilapia to thin the skin, you know, fish thins the skin, rice, fucking broccoli, and that's it, you know, maybe chicken, like a very limited range of foods available to you, a very limited approach to dieting where it's like, if you're either on your diet or you're off your diet, there's no in between, there's no grading to this, there's no real understanding of the fundamentals. Now, this is not to say that the people that were originally designing this didn't understand the fundamentals, but like most things in culture, well, humans just do it full stop. Things become like sound bites where it's like the actual information isn't presented, it's just the end point, the sound bite that gets presented, So originally someone might have come up and gone, chicken breast is probably a better idea to have than steak because, it has less fat in it. So that's going to allow you to lose some weight. But then it just becomes, you only eat chicken breast, So there is that whole continuum, that whole historical perspective. And then obviously it pushes into the what happened with it, where it's like, people effectively used a dieting style to sell them, because that is what happened. People became IIFYM coaches. They're like, oh, I can teach you how to lose weight and still eat burgers and still eat pizza and whatever else. And like that's obviously good. But when you look at their feed, there's obviously this bias then where it's all they ever show is them eating burgers, them eating pizza, them eating, sweets, candy, chocolate bars, whatever, So that's how the pendulum swung the other way, which again, once you actually see what's going on and actually cut through a lot of that stuff, you can actually see how some of these things that are being propagated are actually detrimental to long-term results, even short-term results to an extent. And there's a few aspects to this. First of all, there's the micronutrient aspect. Second of all, there's the satiety aspect. And then third of all, there is the whole, we'll call it, it's more of a psychological aspect to it. But once we start digging into this, you'll start seeing that, okay, so there are good aspects to this. This is not a podcast of us going like, oh, IIFYM culture is retarded, it's stupid, they're dumb, they're fucking idiots. This is not what we're saying, right? Like, I think they've done quite a lot for the actual advancement of the understanding of nutrition as a whole, But that doesn't mean that they get everything right, And one of the things which, like, you've actually said it before, Gary, which actually kind of annoys me all the time because I fucking hate you. But first of all, you always say that it's like, oh, like you think that resistance training is kind of going through the renaissance that nutrition went through. However, I just think that we've effectively got to a stage with nutrition where, we know quite a lot, but we assume then that we know everything as a result, when in reality, there's actually so fucking little that we know. Like, we have this very closed-minded, I wouldn't even say closed-minded, this supposedly open-minded approach to nutrition where it's like, yeah, we actually understand nutrition and we understand that there's these components in it, and there's micronutrients, minerals, vitamins, and that they're important. But first of all, people just have no clue what they're actually important for, like what are the actual things that they do within the body, which is fair enough, especially if you're a lay person. But this is actual coaches themselves, like as in like they've never gone past calories and macros, which is just the very basics. Like, that's just learning sets and reps, how to perform basic exercises. And that's where people stop with nutrition, and you see the really good coaches, they actually go a little bit deeper. And I don't even mean just deeper in terms of they're like learning off what fucking riboflavin does in the body or anything like that. Like, they're actually looking at the entire organism, the psychosocial aspects of nutrition, how the actual individual in front of them is actually responding to the dietary manipulations, and they're not doing stuff like, oh, well, we'll just reduce calories so you lose fat, and they're effectively just like bullying off muscle mass, or they're not actually looking into the psychological aspects of how they are dieting. Like they're setting themselves up for these kind of binge restrict cycles and this over focus on hyper palatable foods. And there's a lot that's just missing from the conversation when people just go, oh, it's just calories and macros. Because at the end of the day, like it is just calories and macros. Like that is what it is. You could say calories, macros, and micros, but that's effectively, people are just missing that whole argument. But the thing that I think, again, this is what annoys me, but when you say that, is like it almost implies that we know everything about nutrition when we actually know so little. Like it's only recently that we understood that, stuff, say for example, broccoli. You eat broccoli, well, you actually get like not the broccoli DNA, but the micro RNA, like from that broccoli, that actually it enters your bloodstream, right, from eating it, right, and then that actually influences your gene expression, right. So the actual genes, to an extent, of the broccoli that you're eating are actually influencing your genes, right? No clue about that before. Like we didn't even understand that that was a possibility, right? So like we still don't even know what that actually truly fully means. And I'm just using broccoli as an example. But like there's other stuff. There's bioactive components of foods that we don't know if they're good, bad, indifferent. We don't even know they exist. And that could be in stuff that you eat every single day, So there's a lot that we just don't know. And to assume that just, count your calories and hit your macros and that's the end of it, to assume that that's the extent of the story, like it's just completely reductionist. Because yes, you will influence the outcome that you're trying to influence. Like if you're trying to lose body fat, see, this is the actual issue with the whole thing. It comes from the thought process that we're actually only trying to influence body composition. Again, it's a leftover remnant of this bodybuilding culture that is the health and fitness industry, where the only thing that really matters is your body composition. Like they're not actually talking about their health. They're not actually talking about even their performance, And you see this a lot as well, like in bodybuilding culture, like they'll talk about their health, they'll talk about stuff, but they'll still do stuff that is actually antagonistic to health. Like they'll be on rakes of gear, like they'll be on like fucking 5 grams of fucking tren a week, and they'll be like, I'm just doing this for my health, bro. It's like this, there is a dichotomy here. Like you aren't actually healthy, and you're not focusing on things that are healthful, So there's a lot missing from the conversation as a whole, and it's actually nobody's fault. It's more so the fault of society. Like I hate blaming society, but the societal expectations of health and fitness to actually be reflective in just body composition change. Like that's 90% of the industry. Oh, is this going to help me lose fat? Because if that's all it is, it's like, well, like calories and macros are going to get you 90% of the way to losing fat. Like, yes, you have to then take in like the psychosocial aspects, the other 10% or whatever, and that'll get you where you need to go with that. But that doesn't mean that you end up with a 6-pack and you're healthy, So it kind of forgets part of the equation. Again, this is where this IFIM culture that really pushes forward the concept of, I'm just going to eat absolute crap and then bang back a few multivitamins and we call it good to go. Again, that will cover your bases to an extent, but as I said, there's other stuff in food that we don't know what the fuck it's doing. We don't even know it exists. So there is that aspect that has to be layered onto the conversation. But yeah.
Firstly, to avoid myself being misquoted, the thing that I always say, I always say it, I'm like, people are making the same mistakes with training that they used to make with nutrition, in that people are happy to be really flexible when it comes to nutrition, but then they're really rigid when it comes to training. So that's my quote. That's what I always say. But anyway, that aside, so to play devil's advocate on the side of the, it's just IFYM, calories and macros. You can make a really strong case that all you need to worry about is just it's just calories. Because, for example, if you're dealing with the obese population and they have lots of associated comorbidities, things like cardiovascular disease, things like, insulin resistance, or, osteoarthritis. So you've got all these different pathologies. There are links between those different pathophysiological states that can all be improved by simply losing body fat, which can be achieved by simply reducing calorie intake, and that's all you have to do. So what that means is that there is merit to just focusing on those things, in that, yeah, you can actually do this and significantly really improve someone's health. Similarly, if you can avoid being overweight or obese in the first place through just having a calorie-centric approach to your nutrition, then again, that's great. There's merit to that. Similarly, from a performance perspective,
Just
calories are...
before we go
Go on.
Just the thought process of calories as a whole, like all of the other stuff is secondary to this. So you have to always keep that in mind. Like you'll see this as well. And this is something that is actually really annoying about nutrition as a whole. Like people will say, for example, saturated fat is a problem, right? Because they'll use studies and they'll be like, look at this population, this country. Like they always use Sweden or Norway. I can't remember which one it was, but they
Finland.
Finland, right? They told their population to reduce saturated fat, and all of a sudden they saw a reduction in heart disease. So you can use that and you can make that out and be like, look, saturated fat, clear evidence here. But you also look at all those studies and the average people were dropping like 11 to 15 pounds, right? So was it the reduction in body fat that caused this? Like, because that you could literally say eat saturated fat only and have a reduction in body fat, and you would see an improvement in health from a calorie perspective. Now, I'm not saying that, saturated fat is completely exonerated. That's, again, this is, I don't want to dichotomize the argument, but the calorie aspect is so often forgotten in the argument that, like, people fall into the camp of, oh, well, it's just certain types of food. Let's eat healthily, and that's all you need to do. But they're not controlling for calories. So I want to get that across, that it is, you have to have that underlying fundamentals of a calorie appropriate diet. And if you want to compare anything in health, if you don't account for calories and body fat as a whole, like the level of body fat change or weight change, then like your research is so up for interpretation. That, if you want to show an actual link, like your control group has to lose the same amount of weight as the people that took away saturated fat or whatever you're trying to control for. So what Gary's saying there is, like, the calorie aspect is fundamental. So I also don't want this argument, this podcast, to be brought away into another tangent where it's like, oh, so they're actually just saying just eat healthy food, and like IFYM is like a load of bullshit. Like I don't want that to be the message. Like the fundamentals are still the fundamentals: a calorie appropriate diet, macronutrient control. But there are other aspects to this whole argument that need to be discussed out. But anyway, sorry for interrupting.
Yeah. So as I was saying, you've got your calorie centric approach, and it can indeed lead to improvements in body composition and health. Like, because like that's the thing I want to make clear, is that some people will just, it's just a typical whataboutism. Like if you start talking about like calories matter, they'll be like, what about health? But what about health? Like that's always the argument. So calories still super important for health, and you can make massive improvements in your health focusing only on calories. Same with performance. Calories fundamentally is some way of quantifying the amount of energy you have in your diet that can then be converted into the energy that you require to be able to exercise. So that's really important as well for performance. So basically what I'm saying is that there's a lot of merit there to focusing on calories, really important. But it's often calories is not a behavioral intervention. Like calories is some way of quantifying the results of the behaviors that you partake in. And this is the really, really key point, is that for people like us who are in the fitness sphere, and we're willing to use MyFitnessPal, we're willing to weigh our foods to calculate all our calories and come up with some number. Like, it's fine to say like that's all you have to focus on, but in the real world you are fundamentally eating foods, and your foods have some qualities and quantities related to their satiety. How full they keep you. How full are you after your meals? How much actual nutrition are you getting from the foods that you're consuming? how palatable are they? In that, like, how likely are you to want to overeat a certain food? A baked potato and a Pop-Tart, very different from that perspective, you know, in terms of how the drive to continue eating. So you have to consider how the foods that you are consuming relate to your nutrition, your fullness, and your desire to keep eating, which is all like integrated with like neuroendocrine signals and all these complex things going on in your body. So we can't just reduce it to being like, just control your calories and worry about nothing else. Because in the real world, people eat food, and we have to consider those factors. So if you were to give advice to a general lay person, and they're going to say to you, I have no desire to track calories, what should I do? You can't just say, oh yeah, just eat less, but eat whatever you want. It's like that's not helpful at all. And everyone knows that. So we always have to consider, like, how do things actually play out in the real world? And it is fundamentally those behaviors, the food choices that you make, that lead to you being able to control your calories. So we have to recognize that there are proximal behaviors there. And that even goes for those of us who are tracking our calories. Tracking your calories, like let's say you're aiming for 2,000 a day and consuming, you know, loads of vegetables, like 8 to 12 servings of like fruits and vegetables per day, eating plenty of protein in your diet, consuming sufficient fiber, and choosing higher volume foods where possible. Like, for example, getting your potatoes or your carbohydrates from potatoes instead of cereals and, you know, Pop-Tarts. Like, everyone knows that is very different. And dietary adherence, if you were to look at two totally different diets there, one would expect that it'd be easier to adhere to the whole food diet because you'd be fuller, and you would have, like, I almost call it like taste perception, in that, like, when you're used to eating a blander quality diet, it appears tastier than if you were used to a hyper palatable diet based on junk food, and then you eat the chicken and potatoes and broccoli. You know, like, it's like you're just being accustomed down that path instead. So you do really have to consider what the difference between diets actually is, even when you are accounting for calories and potentially even macronutrients. And again, like, the adherence conversation does get more complicated, and that's will be what we'll get into, because you could be the person that's just, because that could sound like I'm making the case just for quote unquote clean eating, but your adherence could also be supported by the inclusion of some of those hyperpalatable foods. So I guess the way I think it's helpful to look at it is consider the proximal behaviors while trying to control distal measure of, like, these are my calories, you know?
Yeah, like that adherence aspect is a really hard one to decipher out, because, like,
Mm-hmm.
to make a perfect statement just assumes that we're all the same, you know, which is
Yeah.
obviously not the case. Like, there's an individual out there that, you know, they're like, okay, I'm going to try this IIFYM stuff, but I'm going to go for the approach that we're going to advocate, which is roughly like eat whole foods 80 to 90% of the time, and, you know, have some discretionary calories that, you know, perhaps would allow you to fit stuff in that, you know, you may be craving. However, that might be, for that individual, terrible. Like, they might be like, as soon as I have that one cookie, I'm off on a mad one. I'm on a binge, you know? So to advocate for that person to say, oh, your adherence is going to improve if you have a little bit more flexibility in your diet, like that might be the worst advice for that person, you know? So, like, obviously there is an individual aspect to it. And as a result, you know, anything that is a generalized bit of information isn't going to help everyone. But that's the case with all information. You know, it has to be individualized to that actual individual that is trying to lose weight, gain muscle, whatever the fuck, right? So that has to be taken into account, that when we discuss adherence, you know, you might be the individual that you actually adhere better to your diet if there's just no, like, it is a bland, quote unquote, bland diet. Like, yes, you're still spicing your food, you're still eating tastier, you know, fruits and veg and whatever, but you're not going for these, like, hyper palatable foods. You know, you're not going for, you know, a Big Mac or something, or whatever it is that you're like, oh yeah, that really makes me lick my lips. You know, that's whatever that is. You're not going for those types of food. You're just sticking to a kind of set list of foods that you're like, yeah, they're a little bit more bland, but, you know, it actually helps me adhere to my diet because, you know, I just eat this. I don't eat. I know if I eat something really, really tasty, I just overeat, you know? So again, like that could be an argument for someone having, a more fat-based diet or a more carb-based diet. Again, there's so many ways to actually individualize that so that someone can actually adhere better. But also there are the individuals then that, again, put it out there and will argue the opposite side of things. They're like, oh, well, I actually adhere to my calories better when 90% of it is junk food, But in most cases, you'll see people doing these behaviors that allow them or facilitate them doing that, which aren't really healthful behaviors. And what I mean by that is, like, people will fast all day just so they can eat a 2,000 calorie meal at night and be like, yeah, bro, I'm just intermittent fasting. That's how I'm able to stay lean. I'm able to control my calories and still eat this junk food, And it's like, okay, like that is definitely an approach that will allow you to hit your calories and adhere to those calories. But is that necessarily the best approach from a health perspective or a muscle gain perspective? Like, if you're eating all your protein in one meal versus having that spread out throughout the day, there's obviously some difference there, even if it is calorie matched. However, because, as we said earlier on, like that individual may actually then lose weight, get shredded or whatever, like that almost allows them to justify their level of whatever, IFIM, whatever you want to say, their level of flexibility within their diet. They're like, look, I got absolutely fucking shredded and I was eating Pop-Tarts every single day of the week, And it's like, okay, well, like, that doesn't mean that was the best approach for you to do that. Just because you actually got the outcome that you wanted, And again, I'm not saying that I have the best approach, but this is what I'm saying. You see in the fitness industry, you just see people, it's almost like a survivorship bias where it's like, they survived their diet, so therefore their diet was justified, And it's like, that's not how we should be looking at this. We should be looking at things from, like, let's actually make the most optimal diet, right? And then we can see how we can deviate from that so that you can actually both adhere to it, and actually enjoy the process, Because again, I'm not advocating here, which again is, people just get pushed into these dichotomous camps where it's like, you're either IFIM or you're clean eating, bruh, and that's where people are pushed into. And it's like, let's meet here in the middle somewhere where it's like, we have a focus on actually eating real food for the majority of the time. And, if you want to have a little bit more flexibility within, first of all, the quote unquote real food that you're eating, it's like, okay, well, you don't actually have to just eat chicken. You can have a variety of meats. You can have a variety of vegetables. You can have a variety of carb sources. So there's a lot of flexibility within the quote unquote real or clean foods that you're eating there, but then also have the perspective that, if I do want to fit in some quote unquote junk food, I have the ability to put that in. And again, that could be literally something like 50 calories per day, where you're just like, I'm just putting that in. Like, we'll say there's an unclean food that you're eating, an IFIM food, and you're like, I actually really enjoy that. I like to have chocolate in my oats, and it's like, okay, cool. Like, that actually then allows you to stick to your diet, hit your calories, hit your macronutrients, and it gives you that little bit of satiety. Maybe you have oats before bed and you put some chocolate in and you're like, chocolate's a bit of a bad food, man, I don't know. And you're like, well, it actually allows me to adhere to my diet better overall. However, then people will then justify that and be like, okay, so if a little bit is good, then obviously the same is true with a lot. So, I was having this bowl of oats with a little bit of chocolate in it, but I'm actually going to switch that out for, some Cocoa Pops or something. And it's like, okay, like, yes, that again, it would be a perfect approach. But, perhaps the food volume aspect now means that you wake up and you're hungrier, and now you're kind of like, okay, man, now it's a little bit harder to stick to my diet the next day. And again, like, all of these little things add up, because if you're finding every single morning you wake up and you're starving and it's hard to stick to your diet, like, that's almost setting you up for, almost failure, because you're kind of like, well, I'm already starting my day at a deficit of mental energy or whatever you want to say, because, like, willpower is not finite. I know that was a thought process a while ago, but it's not finite. Like, you do have unlimited willpower, but if you start your day and you're like, oh, I'm fucking starving already, that's a potential negative towards you actually adhering to your day long term. Obviously, there's different things you can do to offset that. But what I'm saying is you have to take into account the actual food volume, the actual food quantity, quality, all of that stuff. Like, again, like as I was saying before, like there's stuff that we don't even know about the human body and how it responds to nutrition. Like, it was only recently that, and we still also don't really know this, like we actually have nerve cells, not just like your vagus nerve and stuff, but nerve cells on the outside of your stomach. And I've only been recently reading this research, so I'm like probably going to butcher it. But like you actually get, rather than having a hormonal response, which is what we thought was like, it was a fully hormonal response to eating in terms of, you had ghrelin and all of those, like say hunger hormones and satiety hormones being secreted, and they were targeted for drugs, like pharmacologically targeted, and be like, okay, well, if we can target this, we can control appetite. And it didn't really work. And now what they think is like, there's actually other stuff going on that it's actually able to send a neurological signal, as in like an electrical, if you want to look at it like that. So your brain actually gets feedback almost immediately in terms of what you're eating. So there's this whole other aspect, like they're almost like glial cells, on like nerve cells or whatever, on your in just on the outside of your intestinal lining, or the inside, depending on what way you look at it. And they're transmitting this information in a second, like the same way you would be able to like transmit a nerve impulse to your arm. So what the fuck does that mean? I have no fucking clue. In terms of what does that mean in terms of our dietary practices and in terms of how we approach diet, how we look at things, I don't know at the moment. But like that's what I'm saying. There's so much, like the way people approach nutrition from a fully IIFIM perspective almost makes it look like we know everything about nutrition, when that isn't the case at all. But I also would look at it from the perspective of the people that are like the floating heads of IIFIM don't eat in a manner that the general IIFIM people eat, like the actual people that propagate the thought process, or originally brought up the thought process, generally eat real food, like quote unquote real food, like again, definition of that, but they eat real food and then they fit in a little bit of whatever they want, and again, that doesn't have to be a like all out binge fest, but it could be like, all right, well, I actually like to have burritos, and they don't really fit into my narrow perspective of these are clean foods, but they're able to fit the calories in, and as a result enjoy their diet as a whole. So basically there's a lot more to this whole diet stuff than, first of all, we even know, both from a food perspective and a human physiology perspective. So to think that you can be so reductionist and say it's all just calories, and it's all just calories and macronutrients, like it's blatantly wrong. Like, yes, like you are right, but it's ignorant in terms of the actual, like what that actually means. Like thermodynamics are the governing factor here, but the extent to how that influences your actual practices and what the diet actually looks like can be very easily misrepresented.
Yes, sir. And like that is like a lot of that is even like just focusing on like our narrow focus on body composition within the physique sphere, as in like that's generally what people talk about when they talk about IIFYM. But like you're not just thinking about like calories when you're thinking about things like your risk of colorectal cancer or your risk of developing atherosclerosis. Like these are the things that actually kill people. And I mean, this is the stuff you need to concern yourself with in the long term, in that like you should be opting for, like what I would argue for, a more conservative approach to diet when you are thinking about the types of foods that you eat. In that if you think that something is pretty radical, like consuming all of your carbohydrates from sugar, like just sugary kind of processed foods, like that might work, but do you think that is reasonable based on the entirety of the evidence between like food and diet? It's the same thing when it comes to things like the carnivore diet. It's the opposite side of the spectrum, where it's real restrictive to one food. And when you see people like reporting positive outcomes in their symptoms in the short term, you still have to ask yourself, you know, if something that radical is totally different to the consensus based on thousands and thousands of studies over decades, you know, a century of research, then you have to ask yourself, like, what's the more conservative approach that's likely to be useful for me in the long term? And generally come back to fairly reasonable practices. So like, it almost sounds like we're just like, oh no, you have to believe the consensus all the time. But it is sort of sound in this case to try not to deviate to any radical extreme. And like, you know, people love to
even this thing, right?
go ahead.
It's not even like people are believing the wrong consensus. Like again with the carnivore diet, like you'll see again, people will lose weight while eating it. So it's like,
Yeah.
was it the carnivore diet that did this, or was it a diet that allowed you to lose weight and thus reduce your inflammation overall? Because what people will say, they'll be like, "Oh, my depression cleared up after eating a carnivore diet," and I'm like I'm doing my fourth year project on sex differences in depression and chronic inflammation, and like there's this huge body of research showing how inflammation and depression is a bidirectional pathway here. And it's like, so like we know just from a very simple mechanistic point of view, like fat is an endocrine organ. It secretes inflammatory cytokines, right? So you reduce your body fat, all of a sudden you have a reduction in inflammatory cytokines. Now you have a reduction in your inflammatory cascade as a whole. And oh, wow, your depression is now cured. And it's like, you could have literally achieved this through any means that allowed you to reduce your body fat. But people would be like, well, I was actually able to stick to a carnivore diet and that's what got me all this relief. And it's like, that's not like, to dispute that, I think is ignorant in terms of like, this is someone's lived experience where they're like, this allowed me to adhere to it. So it's like, okay, cool. Like that's just, we found a dieting style that allows you to adhere to it. But when you see the problem arises when people then say, oh, this is the only way to do this, or this is the way to do this. And it's like, you just don't understand the fundamental mechanisms, and as a result that allows you to come to the wrong conclusions and then support the wrong consensus. You know, like it looks like you're against the consensus when realistically you're 100% with the consensus. You know, your methodology of achieving that consensus is different than the consensus methodology of achieving that consensus, if that makes sense. Like we know the link between body fat, inflammation, and depression, right? It's pretty obvious right there. Now, again, to what extent, I don't fucking know, right? But we know the link there, right? Like we can mechanistically work out the link. But if you then say like, carnivore cured my depression, carnivore diet cures depression, it's like you actually don't understand the fundamentals of like human physiology, and as a result, you're able to come to the wrong conclusions, but come to a good approach. I'm going to say good approach. You're going to be able to come to an acceptable approach as a result, you know?
Yeah, and like the funny thing about that is that one of the other main complaints, yeah, that people will say has been cleared up by such a dietary approach is often like osteoarthritis or different symptoms of joint pain, which again, there's an established link between like those adipokines, which those inflammatory cytokines Paddy's referring to, you know, that are secreted from body fat. There's an established link between those and, you know, arthritic symptoms and metabolic syndrome and all these different interconnecting symptoms that people report improving. So you almost have to just take that like Occam's razor approach to it, where it's like, all right, is it likely that this is just the meat, or is it potentially the caloric restriction and the weight loss that maybe led to improvements in some of these things? So yeah, anyway, that's sort of an aside. But I guess like one of the things to take away from that is that there's a lot of things going on under the hood, you know, in our bodies that like some of which we understand, lots of which we don't understand. And you can't always just assume that changing one thing like that was definitely the thing that you changed, especially in nutrition. It's virtually impossible to identify one single change that you made ever. So yeah, like
with the nutrition aspect, like it's harder than the training aspect, because at least with the training aspect, you get almost immediate feedback. Like you're like, oh, I changed from doing an incline barbell press to a fucking flat barbell press. And you're like, well, this section of my pec hypertrophied more, or my shoulder hurt doing this. It's like, it's almost immediate feedback. But it can take fucking 20 weeks, 30 weeks, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 20 years, 60 years to actually see the impact of dietary interventions. And this, again, like the actual thing that's being focused on doesn't necessarily mean that that is the thing that caused the results, because it's very easy, like I said with the saturated fat one earlier on, it's like you bring in a saturated fat intervention and get people to reduce their saturated fat intake, and then all the things that are attributed to high saturated fat intakes reduce, right? So you can use that research and say this 1000% validates our claims. But when you actually look at it, it's like, oh, well, there was this other thing that changed substantially. So did you take into account of that? And like some science will, and you'll be like, well, so this happened, and we weren't really able to decipher what the actual reasoning behind this was, you know? And they'll say like, you know, we think that, you know, maybe this is causing a 20%, you know, change here, and this other thing is the 80% change, you know? So that's how they'll go, like, maybe they won't quantify it like that, but they'll be like, well, we think, you know, this is roughly what's happening, right? So they'll quantify that, but the translation into the actual practices of individuals then is completely different, you know? So like nutrition is so hard, like to dial it into one variable and say that that was the causative factor of the change that you were trying to influence, so hard to do. Like even again, like we'll just talk about from the calories perspective. If you're like, oh, well, we changed your calories and, you know, we reduced your overall inflammatory load, we'll say this, you know, that's not necessarily even the reason behind that. Like maybe we changed your calories and you stopped eating, I don't know, bread or something, and you were just always having an inflammatory reaction to bread, you know, pick whatever food group, food, whatever, you know, and you're like, oh, cool. Like it was the calories now, you know? And it's like, well, like I can't decipher, like you've changed your food practices. Like I reduced your carbohydrates by 200 grams, you know, it's like is that the reason your inflammatory load went down? Like your overall calories went down? Or is it because you're now eating different foods? You're now eating, you know, more, we'll say, quote unquote, whole foods, and you're getting more vitamin C, you're getting more, you know, antioxidants in your diet as a whole. I'm like, I can't like fully say that, oh, it's purely the calories, you know, or purely the food choices, you know, like there's so much overlap and so much, we'll say, quote unquote, redundant mechanisms that lead to the same outcome, and it's so hard to actually fully decipher. Like you have to do incredibly detailed and specific science to fully be able to do that. And like some of that science is just impossible to actually do, because you'd have to have someone live in a metabolic ward for their entire life, you know, and it's like no one's doing that. And then we can use like rat studies or something, but you know, that doesn't mean that they're a good animal model for what we're trying to influence. Like this is why I always say neuroscience is fake, like half jokingly, but they always use like animal models, and it's like rats don't get depression, right? So what they do is they induce the symptoms of depression in a rat, right? And then they cure those symptoms, but that doesn't mean that those symptoms were depression, you know? So did you cure depression in a rat, or did you just alleviate those symptoms? You know, so there's this huge, like the animal models aren't necessarily correct, but then they're used to justify an approach. But again, it's like, how do you solve that? Because we can't do some of these things in a human model. So again, it's incredibly complex. And to say that like it's so reductionist that you can just say, yeah, it's just calories and macros, hit them, you're good to go. It's like yeah, that works from a body composition perspective until it doesn't work from a body composition perspective. And what about health? Again, like what about health? And what about performance? You know, there's so much more to the conversation than just this very basic calories and macros, hit them. Like, yes, that is the answer, but like how you go about that also matters.
Yeah, and the problem, like one of the difficult things that you already alluded to when it relates, like relating nutrition and health as well, is that like problems related to nutrition accumulate, like not over weeks, not over months, like it's over years and decades. Like it could be 50 years. Like, you know, the process of atherosclerosis, which like is basically one of the mechanisms of heart disease. It's essentially like you get hardening of your arteries, the buildup of an atheroma, a little bit of a plaque in the arterial wall, and that can lead to multiple problems such as, you know, heart disease, stroke, etc. So like that is something that develops over the course of decades, you know. So and there's multiple factors that like interlink together. So you're sort of trying to make these like estimates of like what things that probably matter most. Like the saturated fat thing is one. Like if you look at, you know, the mechanistic evidence for why some saturated fatty acids, again, we're not talking about one thing, which complicates it again.
But this is
If you've
also
got
nutrition, like
yeah,
I've categorized things like these are saturated fats, but there's differences, there's shades within that.
yeah. Yeah, so like, and then like you can zoom into specific saturated fatty acids and consider like which ones do or don't increase your risk factors. But then again, you have to zoom out and think, oh, actually, we eat food. So what does that actually mean for food? So this is one of the, it is quite complicated, and we've said saturated fat a few times just because it's kind of come up as an example. But what we're not saying is that like you should just ignore saturated fat and eat as much as you want. Like that's probably not a good idea at all. It's just an example Patty was using, because again, it's just a classic example where you could eat some saturated fat. You know, you could have a little bit in your diet all the time, and that could be just fine. But if you consume like really high amounts, and specifically if it's of certain types of saturated fatty acids, some might increase your risk, others won't. So that's why nutrition is, you know, quite complicated, and it's not so easy to just say that it is one thing. But bringing it back a little bit to the actual specific topic, we've kind of touched on like why food choices, like they do matter. So you should be thinking about the foods that you consume, not just from the health perspective, which is what we focused on the last few minutes, but also from the perspective of adherence to your diet. It's probably important, you know, considering satiety, considering the palatability of your foods, how likely you are to overeat, etc. But then there's another element to this kind of flexibility component that I think about quite a bit, and that's the development of positive habits. And that's where flexibility can be a bit of a problem sometimes, where people are so flexible, they have zero structure, and then they don't end up developing positive habits day to day. And the way I like to think about this is, how much of your cognitive capacity or attention or awareness does nutrition take up every day? Ideally, you want it to be pretty low. Like I don't want to be thinking about food or focused on food throughout the day. Like that's not really a useful use of your resources.
Just to clarify that. That doesn't mean
Yeah,
at the start of your diet, in terms of like
yeah,
you're going from having never done anything diet ways. Like I don't want you to start off and be like, yeah, just fucking YOLO it, wing it, and don't think about things much. Like at the start of your diet, you're probably going to have to think about things consciously a lot more. It might take up a lot of your mental space to actually get your diet in order. But what Gary's talking about is like, you've already got that stuff in order.
yeah.
You are looking to actually live a sustainable life with around your diet, or rather have your diet support a sustainable life, you know.
Yeah, and like I mean, the reason I feel confident talking about this is because I've definitely experienced both sides of this coin. Like I remember like years ago doing the whole, you know, flexible dieting thing, and you know, availing of the novelty of being able to consume, you know, a wide variety of foods. And at certain points, I remember having this kind of focus where I was like, and I know a lot of people have this experience where you're just kind of living meal to meal. You know, you're like, oh, what'll I eat now? You know, what do I have left? How many carbs? How many protein? How much fat? And you're constantly thinking like, what have I used up? What do I have left? What could I eat? And you almost come to the end of the day. And this is something a lot of people report. And you're genuinely thinking for like 15, 20 minutes, you're like, what could I fit in? And it becomes this idea of like, what could I fit into my diet to make it fun? And like some people I know, like they change that every day. Like they change what they fit in every day. They could go to the shop, looking around stores, seeing what they could fit in. And that's where things can become a little bit troublesome, because if you're constantly thinking like in the moment every day, and you've no plan, you have no habits, then nutrition is a big focus in your life. And you can see how that would then relate to potentially poor adherence or some disordered eating behaviors. And the thing is, like, they lie on a spectrum. Like, it's not just a case that, like, oh, you've got a perfect relationship with food, or you've got bulimia or anorexia. It's like there's this spectrum there where, like, if you're really food focused all the time, you're constantly, you know, being real neurotic about like to the gram nutrition, like it's actually affecting the way that you live your life because you're constantly thinking about it, then there's you're probably somewhere on that spectrum that's not ideal from the perspective of like wanting to live your best life and just getting on with it without having to worry too much about nutrition. Like ideally, at least from my perspective, nutrition should almost be an autopilot. Like that's why we talk about dietary patterns, like when we're looking at nutrition over the long term, because you want to get to the point where you've got a fairly consistent, good dietary pattern where things are similar week to week. It doesn't have to be the same, but they're similar. And you could look back and say, roughly my diet looks like this, as opposed to it just being just totally winging it every day. Is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, 100%. And like, to make it clear to people, like what Gary's saying is like, you could be an individual that literally is living meal to meal to an extent. Like you're literally always focused on like, oh, what can I fit in here? I'm going to have, like, even if you are doing it somewhat smartly, intelligently, and you're like, oh, well, I'm going to allot like 800 calories here to this meal, or 600, or whatever fuck makes sense for you, you know, and you're like, what can I fit into that? You know, it's like that is intelligent enough. If you're like looking at your overall day, you're like, okay, cool. I know I have X meal for breakfast, or I have whatever, 1,000 calories for breakfast, 1,000 calories for lunch, and 1,000 calories for dinner. You're like, what can I fit within that? Like you're still giving yourself some sort of structure. And like, again, like what I'm a big fan of is having, you know, we'll call them baseline meals, where you're like these sort of meals make up 80-90% of my overall diet. You know, it's like you cycle between a few different foods. You know, like it might be like I just like mince and veg and rice or something like that. You know, it's like that makes up most of my meals. But then every day, my last meal of the day, I'm like, I have a bit more flexibility within that. However, I still know roughly what I can fit within that, in terms of, I'm like, you know, I might have eggs and toast or something. I might have kippers and toast. I might have oats and some whey. I might have, you know, some liver. I'm like, there's a few different foods that I cycle in and out. So my diet has a little bit of flexibility, but occasionally as well, I'll be like, oh, it's a Saturday night, I'm going to go out and have food out, you know, and that fits within that overall structure, you know? So again, like, we're not saying that you need to have a completely rigid structure to your day in terms of the actual foods you eat every single meal, but there's the flexibility aspect comes in when you're like, I know roughly how my overall structured diet looks like, and these are the flexible components. Like maybe it is that you give yourself 200 calories per day, you know, and you're like, if I feel like having a chocolate bar or something in the middle of the day, I do that. Again, like that could be a perfect approach for you. That again could be a terrible approach for you, but you're like, I know that that's going to fit into my day at some stage. You know, it's not something that I'm overly focused on. I know I'm going to have my breakfast, my lunch, my dinner, or whatever meal structure makes sense for you. And you know, if I feel like I'm a bit hungry for that 200 calories, I'll have the chocolate bar or whatever. If I'm not, I'll just have extra fucking, I don't know, oats tonight, whatever fuck, you know? And so, yeah, I completely agree with you. There needs to be some sort of structure, but also it doesn't mean that that needs to be a rigid structure. But you should be able to look back and, like, if someone asked you, like, talk me through a general day for you, you should be able to have an idea of what a general day looks like for you. Like this again, like Danny Lennon talks about it a lot with that kind of chrononutrition, chronobiology, which like I actually don't agree with a lot of that stuff, because it's almost the wrong way to look at things in terms of like organic systems sync up. There is synchronicity within organic systems. So yes, it makes sense, but that doesn't mean that that's the thing you should focus on. But I think Danny explains that quite well. But anyway, that's beside the point. There is an aspect of nutrition which is often forgotten, and that is like the meal timing aspect influences, like even with dogs, like they'll have almost a Pavlovian response. Like if you always feed them at 11 a.m., like they'll always get hungry at 11 a.m. Like you always find this as well. Like people try to do this. They have a very rigid structure Monday to Friday because they're in work, and then they sleep in on the weekends. And like we already know that disrupts sleep. You know, like we know that influences your circadian rhythm in terms of your sleep cycles, but it also influences your circadian rhythm in terms of your feed cycles. You know, like now you've pushed one meal back further, and now you're finding it hard to stick to your overall calories because, you know, your structure is completely gone. There's no structure to your day. You know, you don't have a breakfast time, a lunch time, a dinner time. It's completely gone. And as a result, your dietary adherence is awful, you know? So the influence of that kind of chronobiology in this whole argument, like, needs to be taken into account if you're actually talking about a sustainable living dietary pattern. And again, I'm not saying that you need to eat at the exact same at 7 a.m. Boom, I need to eat my meal. I'm not saying that, but like, if you're looking to control as many variables as possible, that might be a good idea. But also, you need to take that into account with your overall dietary and life structure. You know, you need to take into account that I'm probably going to be hungry at 10 a.m. because when I'm in work Monday to Friday, I'm going to have a snack or whatever at 10 a.m. So how do I account for that on the weekends? Like, am I going to put some structures in place to actually allow me to adhere to my diet? Or is it going to reach 10 a.m. and all of a sudden I'm hungry and I have that lunch scheduled for 1, and now I don't know what I'm going to eat then. You know, your whole overall structure to your day is just completely gone. You're like, oh, I'm going to eat something at 10 now, and then you end up overeating by fucking 600 calories, and then you're like, oh fuck, I fucked it, so the whole day is worthless. You fuck out, you go out on a big mad one, you know. So you have to take this stuff into account. And again, that doesn't mean that you need to be so highly structured that your meals are at the exact same time to this fucking second every day. That's also not what we're saying. Like, there needs to be flexibility within that as well, but you have to understand that your body does have a rhythm to it. So, you know, you have to take into account those hunger signals. Like, again, people do this all the time where, like, it'll be 3 p.m. and they're like, oh man, I feel so tired. Like, this happens to you every day. So, like, you should be aware of this, you know. So you either come up with strategies to prevent that, or you go like, look, here, talk to my boss. Can I take 15-minute nap at 3 p.m.? I'm going to take 15 minutes less at lunchtime, you know, whatever the fuck it is. Like, there are definitely ways to overcome it. Again, maybe not in your job, maybe not in whatever you can do, but maybe it is the fact that you're like, oh, well, I'm fucking sleepy at 3 p.m. every single day, but then you stay up till fucking 2 a.m. every single day and try to get up at 7, you know. So, like, take those things into account, you know. But you will notice that there is this rhythmicity to your overall day, and that also has to be taken into account with your diet, you know.
Yeah, and there's also this, you just reminded me of that, like, there's this link as well between everything we talked about in the first half of this podcast and the sort of second half. So I basically thinking about, like, right, basic food choices, and then the second part being like routine. And because routine and you've got these dietary habits and you've got some sort of structure to your day-to-day eating and your food choices and your meal prep, then it's easier to make adjustments to your food choices and know what effect they're having. For example, like, it could be the case that you were cooking all of your meals for years in butter, and you looked at your fat and MyFitnessPal, and like 60 grams of your 80 grams of fat per day were, you know, from saturated fat sources. Like, that might have been what you found. So, like, what's a really easy way for you to adjust that? If you had a consistent structure to your diet, then you can basically say, right, you know what, I'm going to keep butter in my first meal. My second meal, I'm going to, you know, add some nuts instead of butter. In my third meal, I'm going to have some olive oil instead of butter. And in my fourth meal, I'm going to have salmon instead of a saturated fat source or whatever. So, like, you still got, you know, you've got some saturated fatty acids, you've got monounsaturated fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, whatever. That's not the important point. The important point here is that you can then, you know what you've changed, you know what you've held constant to some degree within reason. Like, as we said, there's lots of moving parts in nutrition, but then you can know, like, at least what things are making you feel better, or I don't know, maybe changing the blood markers that you're measuring with your doctor, or changing your sense of well-being, your energy in the gym, whatever it is. And your satiety, that's a big one. You know, you might find that in your third meal of the day, your dinner, you normally have rice, but you're trying to improve your satiety or increase your dietary fiber. So you reduce your rice serving by 50 grams and you add in 50 grams of red kidney beans. Okay. And then you can see, you know, do I feel fuller after this? How has this affected my digestion? This extra 10 grams of fiber. But if you've got too many moving parts, you can never really get an idea of, like, what suits you. Like, you never get to learn, like, what actually suits you from a nutrition perspective. And that can be extended further to, like, really improve your life as well. Like, for example, if you go out for coffee with your friend, or 2 or 3 times a week, and you've got a certain nutrition structure, then you can just, you know, move one part of your diet to allow yourself to have, I don't know, maybe you want to have a muffin or something. Like, so you might reduce the size of your lunch, and then you just have that muffin, and it's just not a stressor because you know you've accounted for it to some degree. So the more consistency you've got in these habits and these daily structures, the easier it is for you to make those food choices or food choice changes, and to measure what their outcomes actually are. So all these things are interlinked together, you know. So that's why I guess we wanted to make this episode, and if you guys should just get a grasp of the concept that flexibility, it has its limits. It's really beneficial to not view foods as just being good and bad in a binary fashion. But it's not beneficial to say that food choices don't matter, you know, and it's not beneficial to say you can eat whenever you want, because these things do affect your outcomes, and they certainly affect your adherence, and potentially even the psycho-emotional downstream effects of you interacting with your diet, which is also a really important part of this.
Yeah. So to make it like a bit more practical for the individuals, like what you should take away from this is like calories matter, right? That's undeniable, right? So thermodynamics is what is influencing everything. And again, like if you even just take that perspective and again look at, if you're looking at studies or you're looking at claims made in media, online, whatever, and they don't account for that, right? Just basic thermodynamics, they've already missed a huge part of the overall argument, both in terms of body composition, health, performance, right? So calories are king, right? And then macronutrients, important too, right? So you get those two things nailed down, like you will get results, okay? However, what you have to layer on top of that is food choices do matter. Like how you actually make up those calories does matter, right? Again, matters from a vitamin, mineral, whatever perspective, matters from a satiety perspective, matters from a, whatever you want to call it, psychological perspective, in terms of like if you're eating completely bland foods, you're probably not going to stick to your diet. But again, if you're eating all hyperpalatable foods, it's also probably going to be hard to stick to your diet and actually hit your calories, you know? So you have to take those things into account. But then you actually have to take into account, you know, what are you actually trying to influence in your overall life? You know, like what you should be trying to influence is, again, body composition is part of it, health, performance, but also your enjoyment of overall life. Because again, like I would classify that as health, but like we'll say it's an extra point, your overall enjoyment of life. And the easiest way to do this seems like the hardest way to do it, but it is to actually give yourself some structure to your day. Like, you know, Jocko Willink always goes on about like discipline equals freedom, and to an extent that's extremely true right here, because if you have more, we'll call it dietary discipline, in terms of, you know, what your rough structure of the day is, you know, you're like, I know I have X amount of calories available for breakfast, lunch, dinner. I know what, you know, daily structure I have to my diet, and I know how much calories I have to play around with. We'll say it's 10%. You're like, I'm on a 2,000 calorie diet. That's 200 calories a day that you're like, I'm going to give myself a little bit of flexibility. But you have an overall structure to your day. That discipline of having that structure, that discipline of essentially sticking to your diet, gives you the ultimate freedom to actually live your life. Because like Gary was saying, if you don't have that discipline, you end up doing stuff like wandering around Tesco for an hour going like, will I fit that in? Or what about that? And that's just for one meal, you know? So you have to look at your overall diet and take so many things into account that to say it's all just calories and macronutrients, it's too reductionist. However, this doesn't mean, I don't want people to come away from this podcast and think that we're bashing IFIM. I actually think it's a great approach to your overall diet once you bring in a bit of structure. And again, like there's arguments to be made against a structured diet, in terms of, you know, you might have less micronutrient variability, if you want to call it that. Like if you're very structured and be like, okay, I'm going to eat only these foods, basically you push it back the other direction. You're like, I'm basically restricting myself to a certain limited number of foods. Like you inevitably end up with micronutrient deficiencies, because again, like this is what you see in research, that flexible diets are more micronutrient dense, if that makes sense, because they end up having a bigger variety of foods within their diet, and as a result they get more micronutrition, whereas the person that's like, I just have chicken, broccoli and rice, it's like, okay, well, you're going to end up deficient in something. So again, like the types of food that you eat does matter, and again, that matters from both the perspective of, if you're this clean eating guy, you still want to have variability in the foods that you eat. You don't want to just be eating chicken, rice and broccoli, right? But also, if you are that fully IFIM bro and all you eat is burgers and pizza, it's like, you're not actually achieving what you see in the research with a better micronutrient profile. Like you're essentially doing the exact same as the non-IFIM bro, just chicken and rice. You're just doing it with burgers and pizza, which sounds more enjoyable, but at the same time, it's like what are you actually trying to influence? Because I've seen people that are like, oh well, I do IFIM and all that, and I've seen their blood work and stuff, and it's like, and you're like, markers of inflammation, or like we'll call them recovery status stuff, it's awful, even like hormonal stuff, it's just awful. It's like, and like, what are you like, yeah, okay, cool, you have a six-pack, but like, are you looking to die when you're 50? Like, is that what we're trying to do here? Like, because if we are, then just continue on the road you're going, and they're like, oh, I don't care about fiber. It's like, okay, well, like that's, if you are an IFIM bruh and you're like, I'm never changing it, you have to remember that technically there's 5 macronutrients: protein, carbs, fats, fiber, and water, right? Like you have to eat all of those in macronutrient, like macro qualities or macro quantities, right? So to only ever set 3 of those just makes no sense, right? Like if you go, oh yeah, I'm an IFM coach, and you just go, I'm going to set calories, protein, fats, and carbs. It's like, okay, well, there's 2 other macros that you're just not setting here. Like, are we just going to ignore them? So like, that's not to say that you have to set a water quantity, but at the very least, you should be looking to have the minimum fiber recommendations met. And again, this is talking true diet, not through supplementation, where you're like, oh, well, I had some fucking fiber supplement that I added to my day. It's like, okay, well, like, yeah, that'll help you get your numbers up, but it's probably, first of all, one of the more expensive ways to do it, and then second of all, misses the whole concept, because again, as we said, we don't know all of the bioactive components in food. We know fiber seems to be a good proxy for these things, but that doesn't mean that we know every single last thing about it, So again, a key takeaway would probably be that we fucking don't know everything about diet. So stop trying to be extremely reductionist and go, oh, it's all just calories and macros. Because while that is a good proxy statement, that just ignores the fact that we don't know everything and ignores the actual human lived experience of that,
Yes, sir.
So is there anything else you want to add to that, Gary? I think we covered everything. We covered... I think that we actually did cover the majority of it. Like there's more like psychological stuff we could get into, but I'm not a psychologist. You're not a psychologist, but there is obviously that whole, again, as I said, that lived experience of it. And again, like this is where you'll see a lot of variability has to be individualized. Again, like we were saying, like it could be the person, again, is like, if I have one cookie, I'm having the fucking packet, So for them, maybe a more rigid, strict diet is actually what's going to lead to more sustainability long term. But again, that's not to say that that's the best approach, full stop, And the same again, if you have lots of rigidity and structure and you're finding it oppressive to your overall life, where you're like, oh, I have to eat on this schedule and all that, and it's like you're eating the same foods. It's like that's also not the best approach. Maybe for you, having a bit more variability, having a bit more flexibility in your food choices, and again, like that could be good food, quote unquote, and bad junk food, quote unquote, like I don't really care. But at the same time, you just have to look at the individual and then look at what's actually trying to be achieved. Like if you get 80-90% of your nutrition from a variety of, again, quote unquote, whole foods, like you're doing pretty fucking good, right? Like you're covering your bases. After that, yeah, have a bit more fun. That's perfectly fine. Again, once it still allows you to stay within your overall calories, eat a calorie appropriate diet, because again, we know that matters. But also, like just because you have fun calories allocated doesn't mean that you have to use them for absolute shit. Like if you do find yourself entering into those, like what just 100% looks like eating disordered or disordered eating, like you see people literally just fasting all day so they can eat shit. It's like, well, like if I was just thinking, like, if you had a 13-year-old girl that said that, yeah, I actually just starve myself all day and then I'd like to pig out, binge eat in the evening, you'd be like, right, we actually need to get you some, help. But apparently it's okay in the fitness industry, So like you have to be extremely aware of what you're actually doing, because while you might not actually think that these are disordered eating patterns, that doesn't mean that that's not what they actually are. And that doesn't mean that you can ignore how that eventually influences your overall dietary adherence. Because you see this all the time. This is one of the critiques of intermittent fasting as a whole, because like I'm kind of bagging on that, but I'm going to keep doing it because fuck it, YOLO. But it's one of the critiques is it teaches people to eat larger meals, like, because you're like, oh, well, I have to eat 3,000 calories and I have only an 8-hour window to eat that, right? And that's perfectly fine if you're going to stay with that for the rest of your life. But if you try to then transition to a different timing strategy, like you try to go back to having like breakfast, lunch, dinner, whatever, you still crave those fucking huge meals. Like your body has like stretch receptors or whatever in the stomach, and it's like they still crave that huge food volume that you were fucking cramming down, So people can then find it really hard to eat a quote unquote normal diet because these 500 calorie meals don't satiate them anymore, and they're fucking craving those fucking 1,000 calorie meals that they were having before, So you have to actually look into the long-term perspective with these things and how certain dietary patterns can lead to different adaptations. And I'm not saying with that as well, like that you can't eat in an intermittent fasting style and then you can never transition back because or I'm not saying that intermittent fasting is, an eating disorder or disordered eating. I'm just saying that you actually have to just think a little bit deeper about what are the actual ramifications of this approach. Like for you, it might be perfectly fine that, you just eat in a time restricted fashion and, you don't ever end up craving these huge meals, but maybe that is you as an individual, and you're going to have to then come up with an approach to cycle off that if you are trying to then eat in a normal pattern, So like all of this stuff has to be taken into account, and like that's not calories, that's not fucking macros, that's this whole like psychosocial whatever fucking you want to call it, like the actual lifestyle stuff, So there's more to it, basically, is what we're saying. The whole fucking concept of this podcast is there's more to it than just calories and macros, And again, like I don't want to misrepresent people and say that they're just saying that there's not more to it, because I think the people that are actually like at the top, the floating heads of the IIFIM world, like they put that across, they contextualize that, It's more so on social media that you see people effectively lie and all they ever show is them eating junk, because again, like no one wants to see your picture of your fucking chicken and rice, that's not going to get your fucking 6,000 likes, So whereas that burger that you had that's fucking dripping with fat, bacon, cheese, everything, you're like, yeah, that's going to get the fucking likes, Yep. So like obviously there is that kind of selection bias, but again, it makes people think you eat a certain way and that is a perfectly okay way to eat, when that isn't necessarily, like they don't see the other things that you're doing to allow you to do that. And that also doesn't mean that is a good way for you as an individual to eat, like you see this or you saw this played out a while ago in the fitness industry where people were really hammering like, oh, you need to eat your like cereal after your workout, And you'd see like bikini girls, they're on like 1,200 calories trying to fit cereal in after their workout. And it's like no wonder you're fucking starving. You're eating one of the least or most, we'll call it calorie dense foods with the least amount of satiety. Like you're eating like rice puffs, you know? And it's like, this is not going to keep you full until your next meal. So you're going to have to do like fit that in. It's perfectly fine. I'm not saying that that's bad necessarily, especially like nowadays they fortify cereal. So you actually get quite a lot of like micronutrition from it. Maybe not in the best form, bioavailable form, but you do get quite a lot of micronutrition from it. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be satiated then to your next meal. Like you have to take all this stuff into account. Again, that's not a calories, macros thing. It's like the actual lived experience, how this influences the individual, you know?
Yep. So like one of the key summary points here is that like there is no sweet ball rule. You could be listening to this as the person who has severe anxiety related to food because you are afraid to eat sugar, you know, because you think it's detrimental to your health. You're afraid to go out to eat because, you know, you're so focused on having a rigid list of foods, and like that's not useful. And again, that's why we're saying like we're not going to talk about all the psychology, because that's the type of case where it would be beneficial to work with an actual psychology professional of some sorts, particularly one that specializes in disordered eating. But similarly, on the other side of the coin, if you're that type of person that, like you said, fasts all day so that they can binge on junk food, again, like that's probably not a great practice. You know, that's not great. So both of those people are very different, but neither of them are doing what would probably be advisable. Like in general, I think the further you get from like an intuitive eating approach, like the further you get from at least listening to your body to some degree, being aware of when you're hungry and being aware of, you know, how much food you might require, I think the further you get from that, the worse things tend to get. So like on the one side, you've got that person who's fasting all day, you know, pretty much starving themselves so that they can binge uncontrollably and keep eating beyond the point of fullness. Not a great idea. Similarly, the other person never satisfies any of their actual desires for food or tasty food because they're so afraid of it being harmful. So there are no generic recommendations here. You can take away a lot of things from this podcast. One of them is that, you know, food choices do matter. Do think about the foods that you eat. There's a big difference between getting all your carbohydrates from Pop-Tarts and getting them from potatoes and vegetables and fruits. Big difference there. That's some sort of structure that will depend on you. You know, if you're someone that works at home on a laptop, then maybe it's just the case that you have rough times you want to eat, but you don't really have to prepare because you've got the time to cook meals fresh. Like that's fantastic. That's a luxury. If you're someone in college like ourselves, you probably need to meal prep the night before, or at least know where you're going to eat so that it's not on your mind all day long. You just don't want that. And then finally, those sort of psycho-emotional, psychosocial considerations. You know, ask yourself, like, what is your relationship with food like actually like? Are you intermittent fasting because you perceive there to be some sort of health benefit, or it genuinely just helps your adherence? Or are you facilitating binge behaviors? Likewise, are you quote unquote eating clean because you're afraid to eat certain foods? Or are you genuinely just making food choices with your health in mind, and you're not overly food focused and you've got a great relationship with food? So they'd be my take home points from this podcast. Paddy, do you have anything else you'd like to summarize for the listeners?
No, that all sounded pretty on point. Basically,
Sweet.
calories matter, food choice matters, when you eat matters, everything matters. It just matters to a different extent, you know? So
Yep.
you see someone saying one thing is the be all and end all, they're probably wrong.
Yep, most likely.
Yeah, that's everything. Now it's time to talk absolute shite. First of all, what is the story with group coaching, Gary?
Group coaching. We've just made some adjustments and split it into a male and female group. So we've got one male group coaching service. That was something that we decided on because there are some differences in the typical males and females that tend to approach that service in terms of their level of experience, what they want, some of the things that, might be relevant to each population. So we decided it'd actually be better to have a male group and a female group with different programming, different advice, and also different people leading it. So this is a bit of an announcement, I guess. The male group coaching service will continue to be led primarily by myself and Patty for the moment. And because we are males, in case you didn't notice.
That's bold of you to
and bold of me to assume. And yeah, that will be, staying as it is. So that'll be the guys group. And then we're going to have the female ladies group, and that's being led by Breed Long. So Breed Long is going to be starting this week with the female group, and she's going to be taking the lead there and helping out all of the ladies in that group. So if you are interested, I do think it's nice to have a lady that's actually leading the group, a female, a woman, your preferred terminology, someone leading that group, because there are unique, things that women tend to come across, unique obstacles, like whether it be the menstrual cycle, whether it be difficulties entering the gym environment, differences in size, certain pieces of equipment. There's lots of things that we don't necessarily understand and encounter on a daily basis. So we felt that to really enhance that service, it would be great to get, a woman on board who could actually lead that coaching service. And Breed is a very competent coach. She wouldn't be coming on board otherwise. Very interested in helping people, and I'm really excited to get that going and to see how people get on with it. So if you are interested in those services, both will be linked below in the description box, or you can go to triagemethod.com/group coaching, and you'll find the relevant information there. It's €35 a month for both services. And as I said, if you are, I think one of the limiting factors sometimes can be like women want to have their own group, but they discuss their individual problems, and don't necessarily. Sometimes in some Facebook groups, I've seen women being afraid to comment and stuff because it's like guys who take their training real seriously. So we wanted to foster a better community environment. So if that's you, get involved. The female coaching starts this week, so first week of the program, but you can sign up at any time because your subscription is essentially rolling. So if you sign up 2 weeks, in the middle of the program, you'll just be able to start the next program anyway. So it's not a problem. And the same goes for the guys coaching. So that's there if you're interested.
Sounds good, Gary. Yeah, it is something that I was thinking for a while that we really needed to push, because we haven't really pushed our group coaching. We do have a good few males in the group, but females, I've talked to some people that they do come with those thought processes, like you've said. They're like, oh well, I don't want to be in a guys group and whatever.
Yeah.
So it was something that we felt was missing, and it's something that hopefully we can help push forward in at least the Irish fitness industry. Because you do obviously see female groups online a lot, but a lot of them is like, oh, buy my skinny tee and these booty bands and whatever else. And I think it's, first of all, I personally think it's morally reprehensible, but I think it's a poor service provided to women as a whole, because it doesn't actually, it does, there's always going to be a selection bias or a survivorship bias in that, in terms of people get results with that, and they use those results to push forward with propagating other people or promoting other people to join the group when it's not necessarily beneficial for them. So I wanted to provide a service, or rather we wanted to provide a service that would actually help a lot of women, the majority of women, if they wanted to avail of that service, But yeah, that's actually started today, because this podcast will be up tomorrow, Gary. So
Sweet.
Sunday today. So, well, it's Monday when they're listening to this, or it could be in the future. I don't fucking know. But yeah, it started on whatever day it is, Monday the 16th. Yeah, you can join at any time. Again, like I said, rolling subscription. So again, you can cancel it at any time. You just need to email us and we'll sort that out. Other than that, we do have ebooks coming out over the next while. We do have some other stuff on the horizon. But yeah, life is good. How's college going for you, Gary? I saw that you had a cup of coffee earlier in the week, and if I'm not mistaken, I think I saw you having a cup of coffee today.
Nah, that was a decaf. Uh,
Still caffeine
but
in it.
yeah, there's still, I think there's still like, is it 20 milligrams or something like that in it? I'm not sure.
Still a hitter.
There's a little bit of a hitter just to keep you going. Like, but yeah, I did actually have my first cup of coffee in like 7 or 8 weeks, and I posted about that in the Facebook community, which everyone is obviously in. That's the Triage Method community if you're not involved. But yeah, it was actually quite interesting because, I think we've actually talked about it like before in relation to caffeine, about how one of the things that you tend to desensitize to quicker when you drink caffeine is the euphoric mood enhancing effect. Like that tends to dampen much sooner as you begin to drink caffeine, whereas the general kind of anti-fatigue or alertness benefits that you get, they tend to prolong a little bit longer. You just increase the dose a little bit, but that kind of euphoric experience from drinking caffeine is something that I haven't felt for like, I don't know, 7 years, like whenever I started drinking coffee. But yeah, it was pretty cool. So I think probably like not just go back on caffeine full time, just because I'd like to
I still get,
preserve that benefit.
yeah, I still get those
Uh,
benefits whenever I drink coffee. So like that.
I don't, or I didn't rather.
I also get fucking, which is real weird. If I drink like a diet drink, I it feels like I've just dropped some fucking pingers. Um, if I drink, like say a Coke Zero or something when I'm fasted, because like the caffeine and
Yes.
phenylalanine in it like contributes to like, well, this is my hypothesis anyway, monoamine synthesis. So I basically get like this hit of
Yeah.
dopamine, and it feels like I'm fucking tripping balls. But I'm
Makes
also,
sense.
I'm just obviously sensitive to that. Like I already know that my fucking dopamine signaling is just
Yeah.
all over the fucking place. But yeah, so maybe you should try that, Gary. Just have some fucking huge quantity of like Coke Zero or something, caffeine in that, and fucking hitter of some fucking phenylalanine, fast for like 30 hours, and then just be there.
Be decent.
Yeah,
Look at that.
how's college going?
College is going good. We had, as you mentioned last week in the podcast, I had my first cadaver lab this week, which is pretty cool. Like it was pretty cool experience. Like obviously it's a little bit sobering. Like I think a lot of people found it like, oh shit, this is obviously like pretty serious, because I was actually talking with another girl in my class, and she like studied philosophy, so she was like thinking of this like, oh wait, like why are we, we're focusing so much on the anatomy, like this is a human, whereas I was like the opposite. Like, well, like you could look at it two ways, but she was like, oh no, we should be focusing on the fact that this is a person, and let's talk about their name and what did they do and all that, which is a good point. But I came out of it being like, fuck man, like we're just lumps of meat, like so conveniently work in a coordinated manner that it's miraculous. Like you can see why people are like so religious, because it's just wild that all this shit just works together. So yeah, it was like, yeah, it's pretty cool.
Sounds like a good crack, all right.
Yeah, that's my insight. You can be like, yeah, we are lumps of meat that just happen to work together, or you can be like, humans are so amazing and beautiful and crazy, we are so much more than lumps of meat. Do what you will.
And what's the crack with placement and everything eventually? Are they still getting like first years and second years and third years to do like fucking 30-hour shifts and stuff like that?
It's basically the way it works is your first year, like it's the course I'm in case people don't know, is graduate entry medicine. So it's different to if you just did it after your leaving cert. So it's normally like a 5-year course, and they kind of like, they coax you in a little bit slower, you have more time to adapt to the college environment and stuff. Whereas now it's assumed like, all right, you people know how to study, you people know your shit, you've got some background, like let's get stuck in. So it's a bit more of an accelerated course. So the first year and a half is like real, like all the dense theory is like just thrown at you. And then the second 2.5 years, so from middle of second year to fourth year, is pretty much all placement. And you do like different rotations in different sites. You could have like psychiatry and obstetrics and gynecology, endocrinology, cardiology, etc. So you rotate between all the different specialties. I'm not sure how many you actually get to do, but yeah, it's a bit different to some courses in that, like in physio, for example, you really got to take the lead on a lot of stuff, because obviously there's a big difference between walking a patient down the hall and doing a hip replacement. Like, you're obviously not going to get to do as much in medicine, but we'll see how that goes. I don't think you have to do like 30-hour shifts or anything. I think it's a bit more reasonable for students, but I supposedly it's kind of like a cultural thing. Like you go home when your superior says you leave, and otherwise you don't leave, Whereas physio is like, yeah, you're gone for it. That's it. So I don't know how it works. We'll see.
Yeah, because they're still on that fucking, what's his name, Huxley method, where they're just like, yeah, he was like, yeah, everyone just has to stay awake for like 4 days, when he was there fucking banging back a load of cocaine, just to stay awake. And they still have that medical model, which is pretty fucking whack. Like, makes no sense.
Yeah, we were just talking about that the other day. Like, it was like, for the listeners, basically, you often hear Americans talking about medicine. They talk about quote unquote residency, and basically that was founded by a guy who essentially, was what was he doing? He was researching cocaine as a
cocaine used to be used as an analgesic, or like an
yes, yeah,
so
that's the one.
We use cocaine as an anesthetic. Like, that's where it comes from. We still use it to an extent. We use lidocaine. Like, if you ever go to the dentist, get stuff into your fucking tongue or whatever, it's probably lidocaine. This is why fucking dentists also always get raided by the fucking RA or whatever, because they're just getting lidocaine to cut their cocaine with, right? But anyway, so they use that as an anesthetic, and he was just fucking volleying it back fucking every fucking day. He actually went to rehab for it as well, to cure his fucking, basically, I think his name's Alfred Huxley, but and he was a doctor. He fucking was, doing doctor shit, but he used to stay awake for like fucking 3 days and work these ridiculously long hours. And people were like, what, how the fuck is he doing? But he'd also always like excuse himself from like the middle of surgery and let the residents and whatever take over. And they'd be like, why the fuck are you doing that? And he'd be like, oh, my hands are shaking. And he used to say it was because he had a nicotine addiction. He needed to go fucking smoke or whatever. But yeah, really, he was just fucking volleying back a load of cocaine. So that's why he was getting fucking shakes. But yeah, he'd stay up, he'd work all these mad hours, and he effectively told the medical establishment this is how we're going to set up, because he's a really good doctor apparently. I don't know. Maybe cocaine will do that to you. I don't know. But he was like, okay, we're setting up our like doctor training, and he was like, well, they need to be really committed. They need to basically be residents. They need to be here and basically be on call all the time. They need to work like 30-hour shifts. They need to do like fucking 100 hours per week, and like basically they need to be fully immersed in this. And like people were like, well, like that's fair enough. Like, he's leading from the front. He's doing this himself. He's working these mad hours. But the entire time he was just on fucking cocaine, But yeah, he went to rehab, and I think it's real funny. He effectively went to rehab for cocaine because people were like, well, what the fuck? Actually, we found this out that you're a cocaine addict. And he was like, oh, sorry, bro. So he went to rehab for it. But what he actually came out from rehab with was a cocaine addiction and a morphine addiction, because they were using morphine to try to get him off cocaine. So basically he had 2 addictions by the end of rehab, which is pretty unsound of the rehab facility. But look, he does what he does. But yeah, that's why medicine, they have that residency. They're just like, yeah, cool. You're going to fucking you're going to be a resident. You're going to have to do like fucking 100-hour weeks. So yeah.
Yeah. And that's basically why it's called residency, is because you were basically living there. That was it. So like the whole culture has essentially come from that. And it's not as bad in Ireland now, to be fair, as it is in like the US. I think it's a bit wilder, but in Ireland, like, you do still work quite a few hours, but you do get overtime as well, like, and that's never talked about. So I'm like, yeah, that's pretty tasty as well, like, so and obviously it's a bit unethical to like work 20 hours and then operate on a patient. Like, that shouldn't happen. But there are certain EU laws, I think. I'm not sure what they are, but
yeah, I always think it's mad. It's like they just expect doctors to be able to concentrate after a 30-hour shift and do whatever. Like we know, like, there's so much, like, how much sleep impacts this. Like factory workers, like, this is the reason we have an 8-hour workday, is because they're like, hey, after 8 hours of work, like back in the day, Henry Ford and everything, like, obviously there's a huge pressure from like the whole like labor movement. But he was like, he's a real proponent of the why we have 8 hours sleep, 8-hour workday, because then you have 8 hours of free time, because like that's what it is. So he was the biggest proponent. He was the first fucking rich lad to propose that as a thing. But he was doing it purely from a perspective of this is actually going to increase my profit, because he was noticing like after 8 hours, the risk of like people catching their fingers in machines or producing like crap products increased. So he was like, well, from a cost benefit analysis, like this makes sense, you know, like no more fucking 16-hour work days. He's like, let's do 8 hours, you know? And obviously like that was, again, as I said, like huge pressure from the labor movement. I don't want to just belittle that contribution, but so like I just don't understand how it's like, oh yeah, if you're a factory worker who is making parts for a car, it's unsafe to work more than 8 hours. But if you are a doctor who's
Surgeon.
operating on individuals, perfectly cool, no worries. Just keep going until you fucking leave some fucking scalpel in some young one, you know? Like, mad, like.
Yeah, it's a bit wild, all right. Like even working as a personal trainer, like after 10-hour day or something, you get to the end of the day and you're like, I feel like I can barely even tell this person how many reps they have to do. I'm so tired. It's like that's like not life or death.
This is why they end up with a bit of the
Yeah, I'll try and stay away from that. I'll definitely need my caffeine then.
So Gary's coming in here and he's all fucking
All jittery.
I was just having real chat, real talkative, you know. That's why
It's just chocolate. It's just that theophylline in my coffee or my chocolate. There's theophylline in as well.
It's not good enough.
Sick. Wake up. Anyway, how's your college? It was your first week back. What's the crack?
Too easy. I basically 3 hours of actual college per week. As you saw, I did like 4 articles this week.
Yeah.
But 3 hours of college, I have a project to do, which is pretty handy because like it's I'm interested in the stuff that I'm doing. Like again, as I said before, it's sex differences in inflammation and depression, which like I've only done, like this is my first week doing it, and it's a literature review. So I'm basically just reading the literature this week, you know, compiling evidence, you know, compiling data, you know. So that's effectively what I've been doing this week. So I probably read about fucking 70 papers, or at least glossed through a lot of them. Like, you know, obviously I'm looking for certain things that, like my advisor does a lot of work on like serotonin receptors and stuff because she's actually a biochemist. But well, she's actually a neuroscientist, which is fake, and I troll her about it all the time. But anyway, so she's interested in that. So like I'm obviously looking for that a little bit more because she wants to use this literature review to hopefully influence how she looks at other things or how she goes about doing further research, you know, that kind of stuff. So obviously I'm looking out for that in particular for her. But yeah, like it is quite interesting in terms of there are actually huge sex differences in both inflammation and depression. But like there's so many confounding factors in this that it's hard to like be like, these are the actual things, you know? Because obviously you'd think like, oh, well, what's the big one? It's like hormonal. And it's like, well, this actually doesn't, like estrogen seems to be fucking inflammation protected or inflammation or anti-inflammatory and antidepressive. And testosterone also seems to be anti-inflammatory and antidepressive. So it's like, okay, well, they're the major fucking hormonal things. Like, okay, let's look at progesterone, and like obviously there's all this other stuff that you have to go into. But yeah, it's quite interesting. So I'm enjoying that. So I just have to basically start writing that shit up. Well, still have to do more reviewing of the literature. And other than that, I'm fucking enjoying it. Because we're actually doing a lot of biochemistry this year. Well, this 4-week block anyway. Like, because my module is on like proteins, which is fucking horny. Love proteins. But yeah, other than that, it's fucking handy. 3 hours of college is actually fucking piss because then you can just do like,
it's tasty. Like
you can do like, I do about 4 hours of triage work, 2 hours of, because I basically just go in, I go to the gym in the morning, go to college. Usually it's a 9 a.m. or a 10 a.m. lecture, and then I just stay in the library until like 6, and then I have jits in the evening at like 7:30, 7:15. So I basically just do a 9 to 6 every single day. So I'm basically doing whatever that is, 40 odd hours per week, Monday to Friday. And then obviously I do my work as well on the weekend. And obviously I'm not doing the exact same thing, but yeah, you get a lot of study done in terms of like, I only have to study one subject at the moment because we do it in 4-week blocks. And then also I get a lot of like literature review stuff done. And then I also get a lot of triage work done. So fucking loving life at the moment.
it's too easy, basically.
Fucking basically is. And like we were saying in this actual episode, to make it practical, not just chat shit, like I do still have, because again, like there's no structure to that day. Like it's like, oh yeah, be there for 9 a.m. It's like, okay, then what the fuck do I do after that? So I do have structure to how I eat my meals. Like it's still somewhat similar day to day. Like I basically train in the morning, fasted, and then I have my breakfast after that training session. Like basically my sleep schedule is the same every day. That's 10 to 6. And then training 6:30 till whatever, 7:30, 8. We'll say 8 after I've showered and fucking whatever else. And then drive to college. I'm in there for 8:15, and college starts at 9, say. So I use that time either read some stuff, listen to an ebook or not an ebook, an audiobook, and then eat my food at that time, and then have my lecture, and then sit in the library. 12, 1-ish, have more food. Then again, 4, 5-ish. Like I usually like to have my dinner or whatever you want to call that about 2 hours before jits, because I just don't like having it sitting in my belly. If people are doing fucking neon belly stuff or anything, I'm like, yeah, I'm just going to shoot myself here if you keep doing this. And then I have food after jits, you know? So like there is still structure to my day, even though I could very easily just be like, I'm just going to wing it. You know, I'm just going to fucking have it whenever. And like once I come back from jits, then I cook my food for the next day. And then I also have my evening meal, which is probably not the most ideal, because first of all, I'm training within, like I finish training like an hour and a half before I go to bed. And then I'm eating again, like an hour before I go to bed. So that's probably not optimal, but again, like it fits my overall structure to my overall day. And it doesn't seem to impact my sleep quality or quantity much at all. Like I still get 8 hours all the time, you know?
Yeah, and I think that might be one of the things that does get potentially a little bit lost when people do focus on like the chrononutrition stuff, for example. Like one of the outcomes you do see quite often is that like eating more of your calories earlier in the day is probably a good idea, but when you add into the equation like you training twice per day, it's like most of those differences are going to get washed out. You know, it's like you are training when you go to jiu-jitsu, you are doing all of these things that are increasing your sensitivity to uptaking all of those nutrients and being able to handle them better metabolically. So like, again, context matters when it comes to all this stuff.
Yeah, also like you factor in coffee as well. Like coffee has this ability, because of the way it interacts with like the adenosine receptors, like it effectively resets your hunger signals. And again, like this is why I think like people focusing too much on this chronobiology stuff. Like there's so much that you have to factor in. Then it's not just like the times you eat stuff, it's also the nutrients that you eat. Like if you have coffee, you effectively reset yourself, because it affects your body temperature, it affects your like the adenosine receptors. Like there's so much that it does, that if you have a coffee, does that mean now you're back at morning time? You know what I mean? Like how does that affect you?
Mm-hmm.
All these studies that people are doing on how this, like they're not factoring in caffeine. So maybe that's why there's all these outliers. They're having coffee, they're having 3-4 coffees per day. You know, you have to factor that in. Me personally, I might have some caffeine, usually in like a pill form, before that morning workout. Like I train like 6 days per week. Like 2 of those are cardio sessions. Well, train more than multiple times per day usually. But anyway, two of those are cardio sessions. Like they're real easy enough cardio and stretching. Like that's my Wednesday and my Saturday. And then on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, like I resistance train, I'll have caffeine before then. But during the day, like I don't really drink coffee, because first of all, I don't want to fucking have to go down and buy it, because I'd rather not spend my money, to be honest. But second of all, like I don't feel I need it. Like there'll be occasionally, like the only reason I'd have coffee in college is if I'm socializing, you know? Like if someone's like, oh, do you want to go get a coffee? I'll be like, what time is it? Like if it's past like 2 or 3, I probably won't. But if it's before, I'm like, yeah, all right, fuck it, we go down and we grab one. Like if you need a 15-minute break just to fucking whatever, clear your head, get some sunlight in, because I hate sitting indoors. But other than that, I wouldn't really have a coffee during the day. And like I know how you're going through this like completely cycled off coffee, whatever, washout period for yourself. Like I just notice no difference if I have caffeine or don't have caffeine. Like I don't get any of these withdrawal symptoms. Like, you know, you're like, oh, you get headaches and whatever. Like it just doesn't affect me. Like I could go 3-4 days without even realizing I didn't have coffee. You know, like when we were hiking in America or whatever, like I didn't even think about it, but loads of the days we just didn't have coffee, and it just didn't didn't even faze me. Like, it wasn't something that I was consciously doing, and it wasn't something that I even noticed retrospectively. Or rather, I did notice it retrospectively. I didn't notice it in the moment. I wasn't like, oh, geez, I'd love a coffee, you know? So, yeah, that's another observation. Doesn't seem to affect me. So, whatever the fuck that means. But also, I think if you get 8 hours of sleep per night, it also doesn't affect you, because I've been actually really bad at that in the past in terms of like sleeping 6 hours. Because again, like, this is another thing that doesn't affect me. Like, I can sleep 6 hours and I feel fucking refreshed. I don't feel tired throughout the day, but I do notice that I reach for that coffee a little bit more. You know, so maybe I'm just really bad at actually noticing consciously my desire to have coffee is, you know, a reaction to being more tired. You know, like when we were doing fucking like 5 hour sleeps, we'd just be fucking hammering coffee, you know, and like, again, like, that's probably because we were tired, you know, we just realize it. But yeah, now that I'm getting 8 hours sleep, like, everything's just fucking great, which is actually, I don't know how, like, putting this into fucking an actual real world thing. Like, my blood sugar is always really, really low. Like, even with like 5-6 hours sleep, it's always like 4.2, 4. But now it's like 3.6, 3.8, like, consistently. Like, I don't measure it that often, so like, I'm not like doing it daily. But whenever I do, it's always like low. So that could be good, that could be bad. Who the fuck knows? We're gonna monitor it.
Decent.
I'm not like you with your fucking 11s or something, isn't it?
Once upon a time. Postprandial. Okay. Anyway, but yeah, no, the caffeine thing is interesting because you can have like really large variations in how people respond to caffeine. You know, some people just they'll have caffeine and all they get is a headache and feel no benefits from it. It's like, okay, cool. Other people will just feel nothing. And then other people, like I have one friend and he's like, I genuinely would not sleep for 2 days if I had a can of Monster. And like, that's only 150 milligrams of caffeine. Like, that's not that much. And then you have people like you who are like, yeah, I get some benefits from it, but you know, I could have 8 cup, like you could probably have 8 cups of coffee a day and still sleep just fine, you know? So,
I do get
um,
euphoria from it though.
yes, you do get the euphoria. There you go. So yeah, like the whole theme of this conversation, there are no hard and fast rules here. You know, there's variation in everything in human biology. Like those CYP, what is it, like 1A2 enzymes that do metabolize caffeine. Like there's variation in those between individuals, and that's going to change, you know, the effects that that come out of that. And again, like, you know, like you're saying, if you are well slept, the way that caffeine interacts with your adenosine receptors is going to be different to the person who is not well slept. So yeah, things are complicated. We'll keep trucking on.
You're dead right. Yeah, I have nothing else to add. Do you, Gary?
Nah, just it's too easy.
Actually, we do have something else to add, and I don't know the details,
Actually,
so you're going to have to tell the details. We're going to a seminar.
we're going to a seminar. Oh yes, that's correct. On November 23rd, I believe. I think it's the
I
23rd,
don't know the
or
details.
else or else the 18th or 19th. It's going to be mentioned in today's newsletter anyway. So, or yesterday's newsletter. That's on the website by now. So check our newsletter on site if you are wondering. But we are going to Broderick Chavez is seminar in Dublin some weekend in late November. It's being organised by Lee Bell of TRA Performance, David Nolan of Synapse Performance. I think there's one other company involved. But anyway, basically they're bringing Broderick Chavez over to Ireland to run a seminar. One day I think is focused on more like strength and performance based stuff, and the other day is focused on more kind of physique stuff. And there'll be discussions of like training practices, nutrition, lifestyle, potentially pharmacology. I'm not sure. I think he might touch on it. But yeah, he's if you know Dr. Mike Israetel, he coaches him. And he's also he knows his stuff when it comes to like human biology. And I quite like when people talk about training and nutrition when they have like a good foundation of like their knowledge of biology, physiology, or biochemistry, whatever it might be, because you just get that extra bit of like robustness to what they're actually recommending. And I think it can be useful to hear their recommendations based on that stuff, even if it's not always like what you might think is best practice, because at least you can see like why someone might make a training or nutrition decision based on physiology. So yeah, I've heard him speak on podcasts before, and I've always liked what he presented, or at least the way he thinks about things. He's also a good friend of like Lyle McDonald and stuff, so he's got, you know, some connections of people you may have heard of. So that may be something you're interested in. If you are interested in that, I'm sure we could include maybe the link below in the description box. Maybe
send it to me. I'll put it in.
I'll send it to you, and then or just Google the seminar. You'll find it, and you can use Triage 20 for 20% off, which is actually pretty significant. Triage 20% off, and we will be there. So, you know, if you want to come and chat shit to us, then that'll be a good opportunity, and you get to learn about training and nutrition in the process.
Just don't laugh at my calves. I'm very sensitive about it.
Yep, there you go.
But yeah, I like Broderick. He literally, like, I like when people understand things but don't just try to circle jerk each other off in the fitness industry, because I find that's the case a lot of the time. And like, to an extent, like it's always going to be the way, because once you start talking in quote unquote intelligent manner, like, you're going to attract a certain type of people that are trying to learn more, whatever. So I can understand why it happens, but like, I like to follow people or listen to people that actually go, right, this is roughly what I think the science says, because again, at the end of the day, like, it is interpretation of the science, and this is what I've seen, because the dude's old as fuck, and what I've seen in, like, actually applying this stuff and how it relates to, you know, the outcomes we're trying to implement: performance, health, longevity, whatever the fuck. And, you know, this is what the science says, but, you know, in my experience, this is what happens. You know, like, I like to be able to see like someone's actual interpretation and how that is played out in the long run, effectively, you know. And he puts out smart stuff, you know. He makes sense, and while I might not always agree with his interpretation or his methods, at least you can see a logical path to why he's making those recommendations, you know. So we might differ in our methods, but his interpretation, I can see why he's making those recommendations, you know, which is, again, rare, because people just follow like sound bites, you know. It's like, just squat for big legs. He's like, okay, well, you know, maybe leg press is better for you. Like, even like stuff like that, I'm like, that's like, even just being able to say that and being like, okay, cool, like, I'm not dogmatically attached to these thought processes. Here's my thought processes to why I can make this change. It means that you just understand the fundamentals, not just you can repeat the fundamentals, you know, which is always good.
Yep. So get involved. Triage 20 at checkout. We don't really get anything in return, I don't think, but you just should.
Okay, I don't mind. I like them. We might even have them on
20% off. Like.
Okay, like.
Yeah, that'd be tasty. Like. We'll also get Dave on again soon, so that'd be good.
Dave's a good lad.
Except he's ginger. Other than that, small and stumpy and ginger, but other than that, he's a nice guy. Like.
You know yourself. Yeah, I try not to, you know. I have nothing else to say. In fact,
anyway,
you're boring me right now. So
11/11, make a wish, Patrick.
I was literally just about to say that. That's weird. I made my wish, and it is to end this podcast. So goodbye.
Goodbye.